Hi everyone, this is Arthi from Human Chapters. I'll tell you a little bit about human chapters. Humans are living narratives with a past, present, and future. These narratives constitute of a number of chapters across a lifespan. The aim of these conversations is to highlight a chapter of the narrative and unpack its connections to other chapters. I don't care whether people are natural storytellers, but I truly do believe each one of us has a worthy story to share. An acknowledgement to country. We acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we are. We pay respect to their tribal elders, past, present, and emerging. We celebrate their continuing culture and we acknowledge the memory of their ancestors. Today, we're going to be talking to Melissa, and I'll pass on the floor to Melissa to introduce herself. Go for it, Melissa.
Okay, hi, I am Melissa and I am a teacher and I teach first grade. And I'm talking today a little bit about a TEDx talk that I gave. Actually, it will be almost 1 year ago this weekend, called "Can We Afford to Ignore the Science of Reading?"
That's amazing. Melissa, tell us about this TED Talk. Why or what got you to do it?
Well, two things. I've always been a bit of a risk taker, not a jump off a building kind of risk taker, something not physical risk taking, but if something looks interesting, I like to try it. And when I saw the advertisement for, would you like to give a TEDx talk and would you like to apply to be part of this? I jumped in feet first without really thinking about all that it would entail. But to go back, I have always been someone I've just been a very justice oriented person. And I've always really wanted to speak up for the underdog. And several years ago, kind of earlier in my teaching career, I had a student in my class who really struggled to read. And that got me started on a long kind of a road of research that I mentioned in my talk. And before I ever gave the talk, I had already been involved in my local community and trying to persuade my local school district to make some changes, some new training for teachers and so forth, and had been unsuccessful. But I thought of the talk as a way to make the issue of how we teach reading in schools more public.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about the reading issue and really what sparked your interest, or rather the deep passion in trying to change the reading culture or trying to get more kids to read.
Sure. Well, historically, reading scores, like in reading levels, among children are relatively poor, especially for a country like the United States. We have so many resources. And when I was in my beginning years of teaching, I was taught to teach reading in a very particular way. And it involved, like if you had an early reader, you would show them a book, a small little leveled reader, and you would take them through and you would draw attention to the pictures rather than the sounds in the word. And this did work for some children, especially children who came to school with a lot of exposure to the alphabet and just language in general. It was fairly successful for them. But there were always these kids that it wasn't successful for. And when they would get extra help at school, it would just be more of the same, kind of this drawing attention to strategies and pictures, having children guess at what would come next, and almost no attention paid to the sounds. And I was guilty of this as well because I didn't know anything different. And of course, looking back now, I don't know why that didn't occur to me that was strange. But like I mentioned, it wasn't until I had a student who struggled that I began to look into dyslexia. And I went down that road, and then that led me to kind of this new concept. Well, it's not a new concept, but then the name of the science of reading,
Yeah.
which I feel like that name is relatively new, of using of that reading is made up of many components, and that and not only that, but that teachers are not being trained appropriately, and it isn't fair to the teacher, and it's not fair to the students.
Absolutely. Um, Tell us about this term, science of reading. Is it, yeah, just a little bit of an explanation. Is it an umbrella term or what?
It is an umbrella term. It is referring to, I think of it as this all of the sciences that research reading. So that includes cognitive science. So this is about like the MRI imaging of the brain, of what the brain is doing when we're reading. And then I think of just the copious amounts of educational research that has been done over the last 30 to 40 years, really.
Mm.
And so I think that's where that came from, is just, yeah, it's an umbrella term to just describe the different types of sciences. And not, I mean, we sometimes use that term loosely, but these are research studies that have been, completed by other people and proven again and again and again. So to me, it's when we talk about, it's very interesting that the last 2 years, we've heard a lot about the science behind COVID and vaccines, and we have talked about adhering to the science. But we don't always adhere to the science in education. That's my opinion, but it seems like we do what's easy. We want to just kind of keep up, what we've always done.
Sure. And with that, with the student that was diagnosed with dyslexia, bearing that specific example in mind, were you aware of dyslexia as a diagnosis? What did you do once you knew that the student this was the diagnosis, and how to help?
Well, I really did not know anything about dyslexia. I was just, like a lot of people, I thought it was about letter reversals.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wasn't until I really started doing a lot of reading that I had more of an understanding. In terms of what I could do for this child, I had no idea how to help him. So I immediately went to the reading specialist in my building. And I think I probably went to an administrator. And you kind of get the same response every time. It's just like, oh, I know, isn't that terrible? But nobody really has a solution. And oftentimes they'll say, we don't know what to do. And I actually appreciate that. I prefer that. Just say you don't know what to do.
Yeah.
But what ended up happening to that child is he moved, and the parents moved him to a different area, hoping that it would be different. He was 9 or 10 by this point. So he was a very smart boy. It was very painful to watch. So I actually don't know what came of his journey with reading, but I've never forgotten him. And that's what has made me. That was really the moment that sort of propelled me.
Beautiful. From that moment forward, what started happening for you in preparation for your TED Talk?
Oh, let's see. I continued teaching, and I was teaching older students by this point. And I think I just started reading different books, and I'm trying to think exactly like the point in which, well, I think I know. I left the classroom and I purchased a tutoring business.
Okay.
And what I heard very frequently, I would have parents call and they would say, my child's teacher says that she struggles with comprehension.
Mm-hmm.
And the child would come in and I would assess him or her, and it was very clear they had an issue with decoding.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you can't decode the words, you don't understand what you're reading. And so I began to do some research about, well, okay, what curriculums, and these were curriculums I would purchase. Since I owned the business, I had all of the freedom to do that.
Yeah.
So I purchased, I actually purchased a curriculum called Just Words from Wilson Language, and began using that with my students and began to see improvement. I mean, and it wasn't a surprise that they were improving, but it was also like, oh, wow, this is working. And that really got me looking further. And it's just like every little gain, I would just kind of dive deeper into the research. And it was about this time that I discovered the term science of reading. And I listened to Emily Hanford's American Public Media Reports. And I was just kind of obsessed. Like a lot of people in this little world, I listened to all of them several times. And I was on a mission. I was like, I'm going to make a difference in my area.
Yeah.
I didn't know how to make a difference on any sort of national level, but I thought, well, I can make a difference in my area, and started trying to reach out. Managed to be connected with a person who, I mean, it was, many people kind of put us together, who was also as passionate about this as I am. And she lives in my area. And she is now the director of the Children's Dyslexia Center. And I work there. And that's who I went through my Orton Gillingham training with. And she is now also the president of the Reading League Illinois. And just feeling like I had somebody on my side was very important.
Yes.
And then in the midst of that, we were also hooked up again with mutual acquaintances, with a woman who is the legislative director of an organization called Stand for Children. And she began the process of drafting legislation to pass in our state. And now that fast forward, that is the Right to Read Act has been debated in our state legislature. I'm not completely sure what the outcome is going to be, but if it passes, it would require additional training for teachers, new curriculum choices. It would sort of change the landscape of reading instruction in Illinois. So all of that was going on sort of while we had just met Jessica, the legislative director, and then I saw the email about applying for the talk. And so I was just on a mission of like, I can do this, we can make this happen. And there's been, I've had a lot of people have seen the talk and have reached out to me, and the response has been really, truly wonderful.
That's amazing. I have two questions. So, Melissa, you talked about decoding. You mentioned if a student can't decode, the meaning of the word itself is going to be compromised to a certain extent. What do you mean by decoding?
So I mean breaking down the word into its sounds. And and obviously that on a very, basic would be cat, act, you're just sounding out those sounds. But as the words get more difficult, then it becomes more important to learn some syllable division and learning how to put those parts together. An error I would often see when I taught older students was because they had been taught to recognize and to like memorize almost the appearance, we would see, like if the word was informative, they would say information, because information was a more commonly known word, and they would see that infor, and then they would just guess the rest and just keep reading, even if it didn't make any sense. And so it's just vitally, I mean, it's it's the crux for me. It's the crux, of reading instruction. So you have to be able to recognize the sounds, and it's like Mark Seidenberg's research that shows that. And when I read his book, Language at the Speed of Sight, and the part that always stuck with me is he said, we are always decoding. Even when we read a word automatically, our brains are decoding just at an incredibly fast speed. And that really has stuck with me over the years, like just that idea that whenever I glance at a word, like I'm decoding it. So I think, it's really important.
Absolutely. No, thank you for answering that question. And my second follow-up question was the Right to Read Act. And you said it may change instruction for teachers in your district or your state?
It would be in the state of Illinois.
What is that act you're talking about?
So there's many components to it. And there's some of it is still being worked out, but they would like for teachers to have to prove on some sort of assessment, whether it's a new assessment or whether it's added on to one of our current kind of comprehensive exams, that they have a knowledge of how our brains read and how to teach reading. But of course, in order for that to happen, universities have to teach, they have to teach the science of reading.
Yes.
And so it's asking for that. It's also asking, it's not asking districts to change curriculums, but it is offering funds to obtain training for teachers and to change curriculums. I hope I'm getting the details of that right, but I haven't been as involved. It turns out that policy is not my thing. I just don't, the people that have been involved are just, that's their thing and they're really good at it. And I listen, but that's sort of where I have stepped aside, but it's definitely would be a step in the right direction. It wouldn't necessarily solve all of our issues overnight, but it's similar to what other states have passed. And so in the US, because we have 50 states, I mean, everything, we have 50 different ways of doing everything. So, but our surrounding states have made some changes and we're kind of have been the holdout, and which is interesting considering we have Chicago in our state, which is the third largest city in the country, that we've just been very slow to the game. So I'm hopeful that this will pass. And if it doesn't pass in this particular legislative session, hopefully it will pass sometime in the next year.
Sure. No, thank you. Okay, so now you've got that email for the TEDx talk. What next?
So I had to apply, and I had to make a video. And I had to tell them what this would be about and why it was so important. And I was definitely at the height of my passion about this. So I think that really came through in the audition video. And then they did select me to have an interview, and I had an interview. And then a few weeks later, I found out that I had been selected as one of 10 speakers. Some of us were students because I'm a graduate student at that university, and some were professors from the university. So at that point, it was December when I found that out. And so over Christmas, we get out of school for about 2 weeks around that time. And I began to write it. And I took me about a month to write it. And it was a 10.5 minute talk. And so it was about 8 to 10 pages memorized of a lot of information. And I just continued to hone it and change it and edit. And that was actually probably one of the most satisfying professional endeavors of my life. Just my husband was wonderful. I was constantly, I mean, my family heard this talk uh, dozens of times, probably.
Yeah.
I mean, they had it memorized as well, but it was great. They gave me great feedback, and so then it got to the day, and I was ready. We had 2 dress rehearsals, and I just knocked it out of the park.
That's
At the
amazing.
dress rehearsals, I did. So
Yeah. um, in the 8 to 10 pages, or rather in the month of you writing it, can you take us through your writing process, what it entailed? Stats, obviously, like
Mhm.
your facts and your research, but your what other things went through your brain at that particular or in that particular month?
Well, obviously, I wanted people to, I wanted it to kind of pack a punch.
Yeah.
But I wanted it to pack a punch in a way that made people think, and I didn't want to insult anyone. I didn't want it to be negative. I wanted it to be, I wanted to come across as just a true advocate.
Mm.
And my opening story is from, it's about the whole concept of a slow idea,
Mm.
that there are so many ideas out there that have all kinds of data and research to back them up, and we do not move ahead, and
Yeah.
we just, it's not that so much that we ignore it, but um I don't know, it's just complacency and just wanting to stay in our routine just takes over. And that, I really, when I had read about the article in a book, and then I went and found the article, and I was just like, wow, I was just blown away by the article. And I knew I needed to open with that. I just got that sense that that was the best way to open it. And so, you're trying to, with a TED talk, you're trying to talk about like what is, and then what could be.
Yeah.
So you talk about the reality, but then you could talk about, well, this is what it could be like. So that's what I tried to go back and forth throughout the whole talk. And that was great. And I think I studied a lot of other TED Talks, and read about, like, and looked at what they did and what I thought worked really well, especially with some of the very successful talks.
Yeah.
And, and you're trying to pepper it with some statistics. And then I brought in something that you don't hear talked about very often in the science of reading community, because we talk about children. I tried to bring in about, well, these kids become adults someday.
Correct.
I mean, because really, if you think about it, it doesn't, a child doesn't, you don't have to be able to read a novel to get through life. It's not, that's not ever going to be a requirement for anyone, but you do have to be able to read certain documents just to function as a person. Um, and that isn't, we don't talk about that very often, about what that looks like in an adult. And because we have so much artificial intelligence and assistive technology out there, you can kind of get by with help from, I mean, we have, text, speech to text. I mean, you can talk into your phone and it will text, so we've gotten by, but it's not the same as being able to actually read important documents in your life. You need to be able to understand something that could really impact you. So I thought that was powerful, because I knew that most people didn't know about those statistics. So that's kind of where that was sort of my process. I literally would go through and label what is, what could it be, and because you always want to give people the idea of like, we can do better, and it keeps it positive. And yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you. I think I've always been curious about what people or how people process the thinking when actually writing
Mhm.
their content for TEDx talks,
Mhm.
because it's usually from a very deep personal experience.
Sure.
To then go, how do you back up a deep personal experience with and layer it with stats, with research, with what could be, and get it to that future kind of sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, dress rehearsals, and you did really well. Take us from there.
Sure. So yes, I had 2 dress rehearsals. It was really a flawless performance and delivery, and I was just felt so great about it. The day of the event, it was because of COVID restrictions, they allowed basically just our family members to attend. And it was in like a kind of a small auditorium. I don't really know. It's a small theater. That's what it was, a small theater. But it wasn't so much the people, but I walked out there and there was the camera was just so close to me. And there was something about it. I knew I was feeling really nervous. I had 3 different moments during the talk that I just sort of froze, but I had one particular moment and I was like 2/3 of the way through, and I froze to the point where I thought I was going to have to walk off the stage.
Oh,
Yes. And I even said, I said, I am so nervous. I apologize. I even said those words because
yeah.
I was just like, and in my mind, I'm like, how can I get back? How can I get back on track? Well, somehow I got back on track. I mean, I had given this talk so many times and I was able to finish, and I finished very strong.
Yeah.
But when I left the stage, I was mortified. I mean, if I'm being honest, I was so disappointed, partly because I had worked so hard and for so long, but I also felt like that maybe I had ruined the chances of this talk being seen. And because I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can share this because I made such a huge, so many errors. And I thought I've hurt the cause. That's what in my mind, I was thinking of. But so, but then some days pass, and in my mind, I'm just thinking, I'm like, well, could I still be okay with sharing this despite the mistakes?
Yeah.
And why do I think it has to be perfect in order to share it? And, what does that say to my children that, oh, you should only share a perfect product? It's only worthwhile if it's 100% perfect, So about 10 days pass. And then the videos, they come out on the TEDx like YouTube channel. And I knew that there was going to be some editing. And I had asked, I said, if there is any way that you can edit out those very long pauses, please do that. But I wasn't guaranteed that though. Well, the video comes out and sure enough, those parts are edited out. And there's just more like, it just looks like I stumble a little bit on the wording a couple of times. And so, but it's no big deal. And so obviously most people that have seen the talk don't know that happened. But it's been interesting because like I've had a hard time letting that go.
Yeah.
And throughout the year, I've had other speaking engagements and sometimes have continued to struggle. And I've always enjoyed speaking publicly and never really had an issue, but there's just always that fear of like, oh, I'm going to forget.
Yeah.
It has gotten much better, but I don't know. It just brought up a lot of questions for me about perfection and why do we think that it's something is only worth sharing or showing if it's 100% flawless.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's good enough is wonderful. And that's something we advocate for so strongly when it comes to students. Good enough. We're not striving for perfection. Perfection is usually out of reach at the best of times. Go and that constant strive for perfection and the pressure it adds, it accumulates way too quickly.
Yes.
Melissa, tell us about if you are in a space where you are able to talk about it, tell us about those 3 pauses distinctly. What happened? And how
Well,
did you get through them?
okay. Well, I should back up and tell you that about 3 weeks prior to the talk, my family and I were in a very serious car accident. And we were fine. We were not hurt, but it was the type of accident that it could have been fatal. It was absolutely terrifying. And now looking back, I kind of wonder if my nervous system was just not, it wasn't, I was still kind of struggling after that accident, because I'm so sorry, I have to put my cat down. I'm sorry. But it's a strange feeling to be in an accident that it's just all those what ifs, what if this had happened in this, order and so forth. And so I do think that probably that combined with the stress probably led to me just sort of like freezing.
Yeah.
The really long pause though, it felt like that someone like just turned the lights out. Like I felt completely like my mind was not working at all. It was very strange. And it's happened a couple of other times since. But I really do think, and I think it was probably due to just the changes in my nervous system at that time. How I got out of it, I don't know. I don't know if I moved, if I still don't know to this day how I managed to not, because I was able to think, do I leave the stage? Do I keep going? Do I, and I'm sure it probably lasted 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity when I was standing there. Yeah, I'm not really sure how I managed to move on. I think my muscle memory probably took over somewhat because I had given the talk so many times in practice.
Yeah. And then, okay, so we're back to 10 days after it was aired. What was your thinking around once it had been aired, the views you may have received, the feedback you may have received? What was that like?
I mean, I was elated. I was thrilled. I was so pleased, but I also felt strange that I was like, oh, I should have been okay with it without, but I was so pleased that they had edited out those pauses. And I think that's definitely just human nature, to want that. But reading people's comments, oh, that was just so encouraging. And it was just so wonderful just knowing that it like meant something to people and that they were like, yes, somebody is saying this like in a kind of a public forum. And because when you're in this little, it's like its own subculture. So it's just like, just these handful of people, it seems like that are kind of going down this journey too. And so it was so nice to see like lots of people like, oh, like this resonated with you. I'm so happy. That was what I wanted. But I never dreamed that it would ever like I didn't even think about like, oh, how many views will this get? It never occurred to me actually to think like that. Like I just had hoped to use it to like change certain people's minds. I didn't think about like it being seen in a wider, just like on a wider stage. I didn't ever think about that.
Yeah. And it's beautiful, right? Like when we express something or produce something, it has potential to take a life of its own, because what may connect with different people, like we don't know what parts of it will connect, what space people are in,
right?
For those connections to be made to be crystallized, and then again, it's seed planting.
Right. Exactly.
Isn't it? Yeah.
And my friend that I mentioned earlier, and she has told me several times that, I've kind of downplayed the talk, and she's like, no, I think people have found this very inspirational. And, because it's like, it's wonderful, but it's also sort of still surprising because it wasn't what I didn't anticipate that.
Absolutely. I know when I first watched it, and again, through when COVID hit, the way we worked sort of changed quite a lot. We were at home for a significant period of time, sort of transitioning to telehealth services, but that also had its layers of complexity. And therefore, there was time afforded for learning, for actually doing a few different things that you wouldn't have normally had an opportunity to do. And I remember learning heaps and still continue to this day. But I watched your talk and I was like, yes, it is a slow burning idea. And why? Because it's not something that's seemingly acute or seemingly, that something's going to happen now. It's a matter of this or this, like the ultimatum situation.
Right.
But because it can take days, months, years. We're okay with it. And why are we okay with it? Yeah.
And I think now that you're saying that, I realize like that's the slow part is what, well, it's what drives me crazy. I mean, it's the very logical person in me that's like, okay, well, we all know that what we need to do, so let's do it. And then we're not doing it, at least not on a wide scale.
Yes. Yes. And do you find that like within that talk or even in your journey, having realized, you talked about students becoming adults, which means there's a heavy responsibility. The minute you're able to sort of conceptualize that and live that, that's a heavy responsibility you're taking on board. Do you have anything to say about that particular part of your journey in the science?
Well, I would say that, I'm so sorry. Hang on 1 second. Okay. 1 second. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. No.
So the heavy responsibility part, I mean, I think that's what makes teaching so difficult is that, it's that saying, the seed never sees the flower. It's this very kind of abstract process where, you're doing what you think you're supposed to be doing and hoping for the best. It's not yes, this will definitely turn out okay. You're hoping. And because you are one of many, many teachers in a child's life. And so, and people will often say that as to like take the pressure off.
Yeah.
It doesn't really make me feel any better though. So I do feel an immense responsibility, and particularly because I did choose to go back and teach younger children.
Yeah.
And so you're like, oh my gosh, these are the foundations of their education. This is so vitally important.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's quite a bit of pressure.
That's right. And if we think about, if we're saying that, you're one of very many teachers, but the impact and the potential impact one person can make in a child's life, then that's something
Yes.
to also heavily consider.
Yes, I mean, because we can all usually think of a teacher that had a major impact, positive or negative.
Yeah.
I mean, thankfully, I think we all have at least one really positive experience. So that is a big deal.
Yes.
But you're just sort of though, like, it is all, and it's very, like I said, it's abstract in a way. And I think that's part of why that probably gets to the heart, honestly, of why we haven't jumped on this bandwagon. Even though I don't think it's really a bandwagon, I think it's I mean, it's science, but people are afraid that it is a bandwagon, that it's like, oh, this is the new thing. This is the new, the new fad in reading instruction. And so they're, rightfully suspicious,
Yeah.
because we're constantly changing, like, okay, now try this. No, now try this. And I don't know if that's what it's like in Australia, but
Very similar. It's,
yes.
yep, yep. Our narratives aren't that different.
Okay.
Yeah. Try this and try that. And I was, yes, Melissa, just going to ask you if you wanted to expand on the idea of the trend, the new fad. What is that and why is it even something that is so well known in the education world?
I think we are always trying something new, because we are educating just this vast and diverse population. And I mean, I have taught in a school where, most of the children were middle and high income families.
Okay.
And now I teach in a school where the students are from predominantly low income families. And it's just so wide. I mean, that just arriving at school with a host of different experiences. And so I think we're trying to figure out how we can troubleshoot, almost like, well, we have these kids with all these issues. How are we going to teach them? Well, and then we have the kids with, who tend to have more advantages. They tend to have better outcomes, and then sometimes we try to apply one, sort of one theory to everyone, or we don't, and so I just think it's like, oh, it's just such a massive undertaking. And I think that's why, that we just kind of go from one trend to the next. But I would say about science of reading is that this is not a trend, that the research has always been there.
Yes.
I mean, really going back to, for me, at least I know as far back as the 70s, but perhaps even before that. I mean, I think people would say, well, definitely, because Orton Gillingham, which is what I'm trained in to work with dyslexic students, was created maybe in the 30s, maybe 1930s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I can't recall, but it's definitely been close to a century. So there was something out there that people knew, and we've just sort of gone all over the place since then. And I think people have good intentions, but we have a hard time just sticking with what, finding what works and sticking with it.
That's exactly, and that's the thing, right? If it doesn't work, we're so quick to change it.
Yes.
But if it does work, then we stick with it for a longer period of time and actually build on it.
And some, there are some, with the science of reading, the results, it's going to take some time, particularly if you are starting with a child who's 8 or 9, and you're just now introducing phonics and phonemic awareness and things like that. It's going to take time to really see a change. And how is it being delivered, and who is the person delivering it, and are they trained? And it's just it's in the United States, we really have such a wide variety of how we train teachers. And it's just, it's very different than, I would say, like how a doctor is trained. I feel like that's way more clear cut, and they have to meet certain standards. But I feel like, again, it's just very abstract.
Liz, yeah. So, Melissa, going back to your TED Talk, after that, has there been a journey you've experienced after that TED Talk in your professional life, your personal life, even? Tell us about it.
Well, after the talk, I definitely felt pretty confident about what I was talking about. And I felt pretty confident in when I started teaching first grade this year. But I was quickly humbled by my situation. And that is that I've really been trained in delivering, reading instruction. I've been trained well in delivering reading instruction to an individual, because at that dyslexia center, I just have one student at a time, and it's very effective and it's very prescribed. And I mean, there's some room for creativity, but it's a formula, and it works, and it works beautifully. That did not translate to the classroom.
Okay.
And so that has been hard to accept. And I'm not, like, even though I gave this talk, I'm not an expert though either. I'm not an expert I'm not a reading researcher. I'm not a reading professor. I'm not an expert. I'm someone who's done a lot of their own research, and I've had some training. But to compound all of that, my students have not, the attendance has been very poor. It's very hard to teach if someone is not there. So, but also having to give myself the grace of reminding myself, if your student is not there, that's not your fault. Like, I can't be held responsible for that. So it hasn't gone as smoothly as I had hoped. And I think, and also just finding I want to be an advocate, but here I am, my full-time job is as a teacher, and that's a very busy job. And so really the advocacy kind of fell by the wayside in the past year, because I have just this very kind of intensive job to do. And so that is, it's just been an adjustment. I've still participated in some panels and things like that, but it's been an adjustment.
And Melissa, you mentioned that the full-time teacher's job is quite a demanding one. Mm-hmm. I certainly appreciate that through personal experience in my professional field, mm-hmm. and my absolute hat off and honor to every teacher out there. Tell us a bit about what it looks like as a teacher working with littlies, because sometimes I think that for people that are not aware of it, mm-hmm. we don't, when you're not aware of something, you don't realize the depth and breadth that's involved in what happens. Tell us a bit about, what you do.
Well, this year in particular has been very strange because our students had the COVID year. Well, really the COVID 2 years. So my students, if they're in first grade, that means that their kindergarten year was spent partly remote, or some students were able to come back for we did a hybrid where they were there for 2 days a week and then they came 4 days a week. Some of our students attended remotely the entire year, and some of our students just fell off the grid and really did not attend school at all, but became into first grade, and so they missed kindergarten. Some of our kids had a preschool experience when they were 3 and 4, but COVID actually happened when they would have been 4 in the middle of a preschool year. So not only are they coming in with their academic skills are not where they would normally be, but their maturity is their awareness of what school means, about that you walk in a line and that there's a structure to the day and there are rules to follow. That has been probably one of the hardest. I was not anticipating that.
Sure.
So I do spend a lot of my day reminding students how to behave. When we walk down the hall, we don't touch the walls. It's just all these little things that you have to remind yourself, they really they were not explicitly taught that last year, because unless they were in the building, but it's not the same. It just as a normal year. So that has been extra difficult this year. And then we've had times where students were out on a quarantine situation where they would be gone for weeks at a time.
Sure.
So small children coming back and they don't, and they've not been there for a few weeks. And so it's just a constant readjustment. Thankfully, we are moving out of that right now, but where I work, they've been there's a message of understanding of hey, we don't expect students to be where they would normally be. But I want them to be at that place. But students need a lot of time to develop, and you can't rush that. And many of our students really didn't have a lot of exposure to the alphabet before they came to school. Numbers, and having number sense.
Yeah.
So it's just been hard. I'm trying to think about how to kind of explain my day a little bit without, they need a lot of patience, and they need a lot of, there's just a lot of explanation that goes into everything, and it has to be very explicit and laid out. And there's a lot of emotions in little children. They have a lot of big emotions, and that can be really hard. That can be hard to watch. It can be hard to hear every day. And for me also, not taking my students' lives home with me is very difficult. And, you want good things for them. And especially at this point in the year, I've been with them now for so many months that, I care deeply for all of them. And so you just want really good things for them. And so that can be just emotionally very difficult. Mm-hmm. I hope I explained. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. So, and no, it's so interesting. Like, this is during COVID. Obviously, before pre-COVID, it would have been different. They would have come in with understanding some expectations, or actually, if they didn't understand it, they would have been ready for it to some extent.
Right.
All of those sort of things. And I think it's important to realize that during COVID, things that we never thought about pre-COVID, just even in our everyday lives, we're having to think about it. We're having to, well, now it's become second nature. We're still having to consider all of those different things that we would have never done before. Or
right.
we were just not used to doing it if we had to.
Yes. Yes. And I think sometimes we don't realize just how important those first years are. Absolutely. And it's where they learn how to be people in a structured environment.
That's exactly right. And not only is it just during your time with the students, but you're having to consider many of those layers in your planning, in your intervention, in your delivery of lessons, in your, like, literally everything that you're doing, you're having to have these considerations in your head all the time.
Yes. Yes. That's by far the hardest part of the job, is and that is where teachers are. And it takes so much time to become good at this, but just to be able to make that change in that split second moment for a particular child, you get to a place where you can anticipate what's going to happen and you plan accordingly for that. But whenever you're dealing with small people in a large group on a daily basis, there's going to be a lot of unexpected things are going to happen, and you just sort of have to go with it. And that's been very hard for me this year, because I haven't, if I'm being honest, I haven't had a chance to really deliver the kind of instruction that I feel like I'm capable of, because I had forgotten about that there would be classroom management. There's a classroom to manage, that you're maybe working with this child, but there's all of these other children out there. And so it's very difficult. It's not like what I feel that I'm actually pretty good at, and that is delivering one-on-one instruction. However, in those situations, I'm in a quiet room and it's just the two of us. So very different.
An absolute luxury, isn't it?
Yes. Yes.
Be able to have one student or a small group of students. It's just, so different in dynamics. Now, Melissa, has there been anything that I haven't asked you that you wanted to touch on or have as part of this conversation?
I think I just want to say, I've just been so honored to be part of this whole movement. And it's just been, it's very exciting. It's frustrating, but it's also very exciting to think about.
Yeah.
I wish it would move much faster, and I have a hard time accepting that it's moving at a glacial pace as far as I'm concerned. But it's really been an honor to be part of it. And I've just met a lot of great people like yourself, and just a lot of really interesting opportunities. And so, yeah, I think that's it though.
Awesome. And any key takeaways for anybody listening to this conversation?
I would say that you should speak up for whatever it is that you feel passionate about, that find a way to speak up about it. It doesn't have to be a talk necessarily, but there are a lot of ways to advocate. And I feel that I've met throughout the years so many people who are very passionate about certain causes, and they just don't really, they're sometimes are scared to speak up. But it's somebody has to speak up. So, and sometimes when you speak up, it gives somebody else the courage to speak up. So
100%. 100%. And that's so important. Thank you so much, Melissa.
thank
And
you.
no worries at all. And for everyone that will be engaging with this conversation, thank you to you guys. This conversation will be available on Facebook, on YouTube, and also on the different podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, and I'm not sure of the other ones. But please share it with anyone that may connect with it. That would be awesome. Thank you so much, Melissa, for taking the time and spending your energy in this conversation.
Thank you, Artie. I appreciate you too.
No worries.